Today is, in fact, day 4,771 that Boswell has been here and been in business. And thank you. We're really happy to welcome Jeff Deutsch, author of In Praise of Good Bookstores. He's also a devoted reader and lifelong bookseller. And he's also director of Chicago's Seminary Co-op Bookstores, which he helped incorporate in 2019 as the first not-for-profit bookstore with the mission of selling books. He's going to be here in conversation with our fantastic proprietor, Daniel Goldin. So give them both a warm welcome.
Hello, everybody. And now, hello, everybody again, this time with reverb. So yeah, thanks, Chris, for the introduction. We are very honored to welcome Jeff Deutsch on his tour of American bookstores. I was talking to one of my former colleagues and sort of one of your former colleagues about, I heard you went to a lot of bookstores on the West Coast and the sales rep drove you everywhere. So is that true?
That is true. I wish I could have been with some sales reps.
Anyway, there's very old style. I haven't had a sales rep driving around books, authors in a long time. So welcome. I thought, because we are a bookstore and not a podcast, I thought I would ask you to read a short selection from the book. Are you okay with that?
I'd be thrilled to, and thank you all for coming out. This is a really special store. It feels incredible to me to be in the space. I've been here before and I've loved it. And I will say that being on the other side of this is really surreal, and being driven around by a sales rep is not fun. I'd rather be flapping books and working the setting up chairs and all of that. But anyway, you did incredible work, and for this community, it's really special what you've continued all these years. How many days? 4?
Is it?
You should all do that. That's fun.
It's getting a little complicated in the 4 digits, but yeah, I don't know. It didn't catch on. I thought I'd create a wave.
Oh, well,
counting.
There's time.
Yeah.
We're gonna catch it. So, thanks for asking to read. I'm going to just read a brief section in the time chapter. I'm a soft talker, so we're good. Oh wow! All right. Anybody wants to follow along? It's on, starting on page 138. And before I get into it, I just want to say the book is broken up in 5 sections. So I talk about space, abundance, value, community, and time, and really just kind of consider the bookstore through those ideas. While time is something we obsessively save, we don't seem to value immersive time. Elizabeth Hardwick, one of our best readers, laments that by losing time, we lose time-consuming reading. We aren't hurrying in order to make time for more meaningful endeavors, it seems. With all the time we create, so to speak, how might we hope to expend it? One would think that the extra time our efficiency affords us could be a collective gift that helps us slow down, ruminate, and attempt to understand the world around us, each other, and ourselves. Hardwick laments not the loss of reading proper, but the way we have focused our reading efforts on, quote, memo and summary, thus losing the value provided by what Mary Capello calls slow time. The good bookstore fosters the expenditure of a certain kind of time, the slow time of the browse. It is a time we take, for instance, to single out which Clarice Lispector novel we would like to read next, or the time we take when our eye is first caught by the curious cover of St. Augustine's Confessions on the front table, to read the jacket copy of the book and the first few pages. Who will grant me repose, he asks. It is a time in which we notice that there are not 1, but 2 new translations of Confessions, alongside 2 new translations of Homer's Odyssey, 2 new collections of Albert Murray's writings, and a reissued volume of Pauli Murray's Song in a Weary Throat, which recalls the Pauli Murray biography we spotted on our last bookstore visit, all assembled on the front table in an effort to create for the unhurried, serendipitous literary discoveries. It is the time we take to speak with the bookseller behind the desk about the long-awaited translation of Fernando Pesoa's Book of Disquiet, or about the helpful new Stuart Hall collections. A time when we learn that the bookseller is also excited about Vey's Gravity and Grace, the ambitious Murty Classical Library of India, and the University of Chicago Press's completion of its exceptional edition of Seneca's works. It might be time to reread those letters to Lucilius. Remember what Canetti tells us. True spiritual life consists in rereading. Such discoveries take time. They happen by being in that space where we let ourselves submit to aimlessness. Sometimes the spine of a book will catch our eye as we are making our way to the register, and we'll grab it on impulse, then buy it on the good authority of the bookseller. How miraculous it will seem in retrospect that we had never heard of Kate Zambrino, and we're fortunate enough to notice that gray spine as we were passing by. We relish these discoveries as we relish the time in which we make them.
Well, I'm going to embarrass myself for the first time this evening. And as you were talking about the evils of memo and summary, I was wondering if you could memo and summarize the book for, not necessarily an elevator pitch, but sort of what drove you to write it and what you were trying to do. Short answer.
Yeah.
And then we'll do the long answer.
Great.
The rest of the hour.
Great. Yeah, like you, I'm a bookseller, lifelong bookseller. I'm not an author. And I never anticipated writing a book. I wrote it essentially because there was a rhetorical problem that I was trying to flesh out and hopefully solve, which is that in the 21st century, no reader needs a bookstore to buy books. And in the 21st century, no bookseller can make a living selling new books alone. Do we even need bookstores? Well, of course, you're all here. And of course, we believe that we do and have devoted our lives to keeping bookstores going and really good bookstores going. And the work that you've done, I hope we can get into it because it's really powerful and is a great model for what I'm hoping will happen in the future, which is that someone can look at you and say, I want to have that career. And then they can actually do it, because today I don't know that they could. So the answer becomes, for me, standing on one foot still, right? I'm trying to memo and summary it. The answer comes for me that we exist for reasons other than just selling books, though selling books is what we do. By which I mean, if it is a retail model where the difference between cost and list price is where we make our living, then that's not possible in a bookstore. But if we think about our product as a physical space that creates a browse and a browsing experience, that is of tremendous value. And this is the only place that we can do it. And the hope is not by being too didactic, but by celebrating what's wonderful about the browse in a physical bookstore, that there could actually be a shift in how we think about the stores.
Yeah, it is interesting that they've always said that up until now, online bookstores have fallen apart at the browse. And I'm assuming that you had similar experiences to us during COVID when the browse went away. Can you talk a little about what that was like at Seminary Co-op, where you could put your actual thesis in motion and see what you would sell and what you wouldn't sell?
Yeah, no, it was, well, not only what we would sell and what we wouldn't sell, which was interesting, but what it felt like to be a warehouse for books. So we would come into the space as you did, I imagine, and you have the space completely empty. I mean, it's incredibly eerie. And we're the ones pulling the books off the shelf. We're the ones finding the books that are being requested. No one is discovering them on their own. And it's a completely different experience. And there were ghosts in that place that were, I mean, it was depressing, but it also was fortifying and helped focus us of, if we are going to continue this work and we're warehouse pickers, that's not what we're here for. If we're going to only do live or virtual events, well, that's not what we're made for. We're here to bring people together in a space, and that it couldn't have been clearer. The question about what books sell is very interesting, because we make a case that we're such great curators and we bring in the books that no one would want otherwise. Every day we were selling books that we had never heard of, which is amazing. Like what people were finding, it was actually really interesting. And I learned a lot as a bookseller about, some of my assumptions about what our community wants, that incorrect assumptions. But the second we reopened the stores, and we hadn't brought in basically any books to reopen the stores, it was just what had been on the shelf for years. At that point, it was, I think, 500 days at least stayed closed, something like that. And we just couldn't afford to bring in the books because the model didn't make sense. And everyone was just buying these stacks of amazing books that have been sitting on the shelves that in general we sell slowly. But it didn't matter. They were new. These were new, incredible books to the reader who hadn't discovered them.
Wow, that's really amazing. It was interesting for us to see what, we could sell. Yeah, there was a long tail of like obscure books that we didn't carry before, and then a lot of concentration at the top. So it wasn't necessarily the big bestsellers, but whatever we could sell well, we sold even better. So like staff recommendations, our event program, the virtual event programming at the beginning that we did sold way better than it did normally. And then what really got lost was the middle. Right. And nowhere was that the real browsing sections, and nowhere was that more apparent in trade paperback reprints. Because trade paperback reprints, that front table, because the publishers aren't pushing them, they just throw them out. Media won't touch it because it's yesterday's news. And even us, there's only so much you can go on about a book that you've been going on about for a year. And so there were just awful numbers. And it was so exciting to have people open up. But it's not like the books exploded, but we were like selling all these books that we couldn't sell for a year.
It's so interesting though, hearing you talk about it. I mean, it's like the entire industry is a little bit broken in some way, which is you're talking about media, you're talking about the publishers won't get behind them. These are books, like beloved books. I mean, think about how many books you read in the last year that were published in the last year versus how many books you read that were published 10 years ago or 2,000 years ago. I mean, these news stays news, right? And so we're constantly working on this treadmill to get books out. And I remember even talking with reps at some point, publisher reps who sell us the books. They said, "Oh, I have this amazing book coming out this season." I said, "Great. The one you sold me 5 years ago I haven't gotten to it yet, but I'm really excited about that. I'm sure it's still going to be good."
And it's interesting that you said that, because we've had this discussion about bookstores where part of the model that I think maybe you're doing better is that the way most bookstores are set up, they don't have very strict budgets, but they run out of money. Right. And there's much more control over the front list. So you have a bookstore of any size has a new book buyer, and they kind of bring in books, whatever, they sometimes know about what they sell, but they're not thinking, I don't have enough money for every book. And so what a lot of bookstores do is they bring in all this front list, and then they push the backlist out of the store in order to keep their cash flow going. And that's, and especially, I know one of the dirty words that, you don't talk about it too much in the book, but I know you've wrinkled your nose when you wrote it, was turn. When
my nose doesn't have a wrinkle. I don't even know how to wrinkle my nose.
Oh, you know what I mean.
Joyful.
Turn.
I love turn. I love slow turn.
That's right. The flow.
All about turn. Yeah. But turn is a retail term, right?
Right.
So right. I don't know if the audience maybe can explain what turn is.
So turn just means basically how many times you sell the book in a year to using that money. So, if a book turns 3 times, it means you pretty much sold three in a year. So that's all it means. And the idea is that in order to keep your cash flow, you have to sell. You have to sell effectively a book multiple times. Because if you only sold things once in a year, you wouldn't be able to bring in as many books.
So the argument, though, of this is a retail endeavor, and so we need good turn. And really, the best turn would be like an airport store. They probably turn at a 10 or something higher. An average good bookstore, profitable bookstore, will sell 3. The independent bookstore, the good ones or the profitable ones, sell 2.7. That's their official number. We sell 1.3, and it's actually a much lower number than that, because that's weighted because we do course books and event books. So if we take those out,
there's a lot of cheating.
There's a lot of cheating. Yeah, that's exactly right. Mm-hmm. And for us, there's this point that selling books slowly is not a problem. It's not something we're doing wrong. The retail model is actually what's wrong. And it's not even wrinkling my nose, it's turning away to the thing that I think we are, which is, and I think what anyone who loves bookstores and books loves above all, which is discovering books they might not otherwise have known existed. I don't know how many books you're looking at as a buyer. Frontlist, we look at 30,000 books a year to decide what to bring in. And then backlist, titles that are a year or two or more old, it's another 30,000 that we sell every year. And sifting through those numbers and figuring out what is right for our community and what will fit on the shelves and what will create the fields, the browsage that our readers want. Those are the questions that we're asking ourselves all the time. And that to me is what a great bookstore will do, is have books that would surprise and delight even the most seasoned reader. And if we're successful, it's not about inventory turn necessarily, because the browse itself being the product, well, a book sitting on the shelf actually earns its real estate if it brings people in and if it enhances the browse, not only if it sells.
Absolutely. And the thing is that if you really talk to bookstore junkies, and they don't need to be intellectual bookstore junkies, they never measure a bookstore by how many copies of, I'm trying to find a front list title that will not insult people if I get the one that they really like. I just arbitrarily, some book A, they don't go, oh, they had 5 copies of book A. This other store had 10 copies of book A, so they must be a better store. No, what you do is you look at the authors you like and you see, do they have this author? I had one, I remember the customer came in, he said, I go to every bookstore and I count how many Ken Brew mysteries there are to decide whether I think it's a good store or not. You had 3, that's good enough. So
what's your measure, Daniel? You have
pathetic. No,
like when you go to other bookstores.
I go to other bookstores. Yeah, I try not to be too judgmental about other bookstores, because I was like, I always, you know how when one of the secrets, anyone, you don't have to be in bookselling, but in retail, when someone's really mean to you, I'm like, oh, they must have almost gotten hit by a car. You say yourself, because it's really the only way you cannot get angry about it. And when I see a bookstore where the inventory is like a mess, I'm like, oh, somebody's having problems. So sorry. But there are definitely, I actually do that more in used bookstores because there are authors that I'm always kind of have my eye out for, you know, and it's not necessarily always the same one. It's just sort of like I get on a funk with an author and decide I'm going to go back and read everything.
Yeah. Well, I think in thinking about the inventory turn question, and I can pick a book that I think won't offend anyone, which is, so Deborah Burks has a book out right now. And it is getting a ton of media attention. I don't know if you've got copies. I imagine you'll sell a couple. But that is one of the problems with publishing and in the book industry, is that Deborah Burks's book, which is a news book that is going to last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, get a ton of media, sell probably 100 times what a great novel by a young author is going to sell, and that's probably a real number. That is considered the same as that first-time novelist's book or third-time novelist's book who hasn't quite hit it big, and we're measuring them on the same cycle, and that just makes no sense. They're not comparable, and part of what happened in the 70s and 80s, and I read a little bit about this, E.L. Doctorow, the novelist, was speaking to Congress and saying, what's happening in publishing is it's completely destructive. We're taking all of these, like our great heritage around books and literature, and instead of it being the primary thing we focus on, it's become secondary to media companies. And this is when all of the publishers were, becoming multinational media conglomerations, which is fine. You do what you have to do to make a living. But when it's suddenly, film and television and news and all and magazines, and that's the empire, and then the books become just another part of that, we lose something really important. And
you didn't use, actually, I was like, it's sort of commodifying of books, which is funny because you talk about commodity a lot, but you actually weren't talking about that. You were talking about the commodity versus the gift concept, which I don't think is related at all. But it is a little, isn't it? The idea of that. Would you talk about that a little?
Yeah, well, in terms of the commodifying, and I think journalism is actually the best example. And we think about media too. I mean, does that include the tabloids and literary journals and weekly news magazines? They're all right. They're all on the newsstand. But things like long form investigative journalism, which have brought down presidencies and has been one of the most critical civic institutions that we have, the business model for it in the 20th century was increase circulation so we can increase eyeballs on advertising for used car lots and whatever else, right? And that model never made any sense, and then it broke. And we all saw the result of what happened when it broke. And I don't know how many newspapers there were in Wisconsin and how many there are now, local newspapers, and certainly the national news. One of the interesting things that I don't turn my nose at that quite, but I lament, which is whenever the New York Times or Washington Post lifts the paywall. Why do they lift the paywall? Because this is real news that you need, right? Or I don't know why they lift the paywall. It's a strange thing to think about. Now everyone should have this information. What does that mean for the rest of the time when it's behind a paywall? And there just isn't a model right now that acknowledges how critically important these endeavors are and how the remuneration for those who are creating it should not be compromised. So people say to me, well, what about accessibility in bookstores? I'm like, right, what about accessibility in our communities? We definitely need to make sure that we find a way to pay the publishers and the editors and the authors and the booksellers and the distributors, while also ensuring that those who can't afford it have access. So I'm kind of answering in a roundabout way to say that we built a model for journalism that never made sense. We built a model for bookstores that never made sense. We have a model for libraries that could never be argued effectively today if it didn't exist. And in fact, I don't know that I certainly couldn't build my bookstore. And this is a huge, beautiful bookstore that comes out of a great tradition. I hope we can talk a little bit about Harry Schwartz too and what the legacy is, because you're one of many people who's carrying on an amazing legacy. But we couldn't build this today. We couldn't start it from scratch. And Seminary Co-op, I would never, I'm not that audacious to think we can build an academic bookstore that carries 100,000 books and no sidelines, and the books are low margin enough that it costs us to sell every single one of them. If you want us to do better, buy fewer books. That really is the financial argument. And that's the case. It doesn't make any sense.
Maybe give you a tip on each book.
Maybe give us a tip. And yet you come into these spaces and it is so valuable and it means so much. And it's something like, oh, of course I would pay for that. And it's just a shifting in the mentality. And even tipping is a good example. We tip in some places and not others. Why?
I don't know. In fact, I think the bookstore is the last retailer left that doesn't have a tip jar in the front. You might see one tomorrow.
What did Harry Schwartz say? I know there's a very famous line. It's pursuant to this, and if you don't know it, I bet you someone in the audience does, but I can fake my way through it. You know what I'm talking about? That broadside that he did?
I know, but
yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, so the profit in bookselling is not the financial profit, it's the social profit. And that was the cornerstone of his approach to bookselling. Maybe can you share a little bit about kind of the history?
I bet a lot of you know, but so the store started in 1927 on the next block. It was called Casanova's. It was a partnership with Paul Romaine. And they were partners for, I think, 8 years. And then it was renamed Harry W. Schwartz. And in 1937, they were kicked out of Downer Avenue for a chain shoe store. And ironically, and they moved temporarily to almost exactly where the Shorewood location was for 6 months to a year. And then we're in, I think, 4 or 5 locations downtown for from 37 to 97, so for 60 years. And then as the downtown bookselling, as it did in most markets eventually, sort of deteriorated, they wound up moving the store. I guess I worked there, wound up moving the store here, which has been a block that, as I said, this is the block where it started, where there has been bookselling for most of the existence of the university 6 blocks north. So Webster's, J.Lew, there was a little period where there was no bookstore, but there was a comic book store. So there, and there's often been 2 bookstores on the block. And then stores closed in 2009. They actually still exist as a company called Porchlight, which does corporate sale And in fact, you might notice that Boswell and Porchlight have a series that we do together, where the managing director, Sally Helderson, interviews authors. She just interviewed Susan Cain, and she has Ada Limon, the poet, and Chloe Easy Beauty, Chloe Cooper Jones. So she's actually terrific. And so they still exist, and they actually have an image outside their store of their warehouse, their offices, of the old Schwartz Bookshop on 5th Street. And I can't figure out how they aren't having people knocking on that store all day saying, can I come in and browse? Can I come in and browse? So when the model didn't work for multi-store independents, which has been, there are still independents opening second locations, but it is a secular, they tend to close. It's very hard to duplicate a second store, you have a second store and had a third store at one point. In that they wind up being a little carbon copy, not like a nice Xerox, not like a nice fancy copier, but more like a mimeograph, where it's like the dark blue lines are showing. And so we made, so we had multiple stores at Schwartz, and that model doesn't work also not just because of the mimeo theory, which is my intellectualism, but also because there's so much backroom business that you do in a bookstore. Corporate, we get some we don't even try, but we get some corporate sales, some school sales, some off-site business, and you don't expand that with the second location. So all that goes away. I have a great example of that with a friend of mine had a cupcake store, and she did all these catering, and she used the store as her space to her salon to kind of sell the catering. And she looked at opening a second store, and she realized she wouldn't get any catering out of it. And but that backroom stuff is super important. And so when we were looking at this model of how to run the bookstore, one of the ideas was one store only, one store only. I want to have the best store I can have, but I'm just not going to do a good job with that second store. I mean, honestly, I thank you for the compliments, but I feel like I can barely keep one store going. And but what I do know is that all that backroom stuff really helps our bottom line. There is margin in it. It's not as much margin as one would want, but it's enough volume, and it's the make or break. And it really made us one of the things that made us a sustainable store. Now, of course, I look around and it's like, we have a lot of gift stuff compared to you, but actually our percentage is actually lower than the average.
The gift stuff is great, by the way. And I personally shop sidelines and gifts in every bookstore I go into. So I love sidelines and gifts. I make a point.
You wouldn't know it.
You wouldn't know it from the book. But here's the thing about sidelines and gifts is that, is it an economic necessity in order to sell books? If it's a curatorial decision to provide for the community a different kind of product, great. But in order to make a living as a bookseller, you have to sell it. That's the only place you get real margin.
Well, it's interesting you said that, because I can sometimes see from a store by the way they position the gift product. So one of our, there's a store, I really love the owners, but one of the things that my sister, who lives in the town where the store is, and what she hates about it is it's just crammed with product in the front of the store. And I just felt one of the decisions we made with this store, and I'm sure you think about that too, is like, what's the first impression you give when you walk in a store? And so we had made the decision that you should see books before you see anything else. And so the very front of the store should not have a lot of gift product, and let them come in and get it later. Mm-hmm. Interviewing who? Can we talk a little bit about your background? I mean, the book is beautifully written, and you really learn a lot about Jeff as a person, and your upbringing as an Orthodox Jew, and how this. I kept thinking of people of the book, just because but only one book. So Now you're people of the books.
Right.
And could you talk a little about like your upbringing and how it sort of led you into book selling and led you away, like it was both a continuation and a break?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's a powerful question, and it's one that I think without my upbringing, I certainly would not have become a bookseller, and without leaving my upbringing, I certainly wouldn't have become a reader, which is interesting. I grew up as an Orthodox Jew in and around Brooklyn, New York, from Borough Park originally, and lived in Borough Park, Flatbush, and Elizabeth, New Jersey, all of which have yeshiva communities there. I hated reading as a kid. I was not interested at all. I was lucky enough to have an atheist feminist mother who somehow found her way into this community. I mean, she was a pariah, but was in the community. And one of the things that really struck me was the presence of books. There were books everywhere. And not only were there books everywhere, but they were used. People were reading all the time. They were reading one book and its commentaries, and thousands of commentaries, but the main commentary are the 63 tractates of the Talmud, which are amazing. I mean, 30% amazing and 70% really boring legalistic stuff about when a cow falls over a cliff. Is it the person whose land it falls on that killed it, or the person? Anyway, I mean, it could be really interesting if you have a legalistic mind. But this idea that people were not only reading when they were in school, they weren't only reading for, and they weren't reading for entertainment only. There are entertaining things, but not entertainment only. They were reading in order to figure out how to live a meaningful life. And it was a part of the everyday in figuring out how to live a meaningful life. And when I left the fold, I was a teenager and I left the fold and I went to, I was suddenly in America, not in a shtetl. I was in America where people went to school, they got educated, they were stamped with that official designation that they're suddenly educated with whatever letters follow their name, and they're done. And they can be educated so they can make a living. And the idea that you weren't going to constantly surround yourself with books and read serious books, and I don't mean serious as in good or better than unserious, it's just a type of book where it is a little bit challenging or a little bit focused on how to live, what to do. That notion stuck with me. And the only places I ever really felt comfortable were in book-lined spaces, which is where I came from. Everywhere was book-lined, or outdoors where there was just quiet because, let's grow up in and around New York, and a little bit of quiet goes a long way. So that recognition for me was really critical. And when I went to the seminary co-op, it actually was 6 months before I started as a bookseller, so 1994. And it was also the same year that Jeff Bezos founded Amazon, coincidentally. And I went to the seminary co-op, and for those of you who haven't been to it, it's singular. I mean, I've been to, I don't know, 15 bookstores in the last few weeks. And I go to books, every town I'm in, I go to the other bookstores there too. I've been browsing a lot. It's been amazing. There is nothing like the co-op, and there never has been, or I should say, I've never experienced anything like it anywhere else. And the idea that this store could exist, it changed not only my life, but it changed my conception of what the work can and should be. And everywhere I went after, I was trying to replicate that experience. And to have the opportunity, this was in 2014, to come to the seminary co-op as the director, knowing that it was about to go out of business. It should have gone out of business probably 20 years before. There was no model for it. It frankly was founded on a false premise, which, so it's a scam to begin with. I can't even talk about this. Yeah, so it's a scam to begin with.
No, that's not in the book,
That was the next book I'm saving it. That's going to get all the media attention.
Yes, now.
Yeah. So in 1961, dozen or so students from the Chicago Theological Seminary, these are seminary students, mind you, so it should be like a height of ethics, right? They got together, they realized that they could, if they pooled their resources and pretended that they were a wholesaler, not customers, that they could get their books much cheaper. And so they formed a co-op in order to get cheap books as resellers, but they really weren't. It was just a couple of kids in the dorm. And then my predecessor, who was there for 43 years, Jack Sella, who I write about and you know, he just completely ignored the bylaws that explicitly say that not only that you can only sell to seminaries, but seminaries in Hyde Park in the neighborhood in Chicago is the only place we were allowed to sell to, and it was in the bylaws. So it was legally binding. I don't think we can get in trouble for this anymore, but we basically ignored that and built the best academic bookstore in the country.
I'm sorry, why did they put that in the bylaws?
Because they were just trying to get some cheap books. It's the same reason why we ignore the cost of low prices elsewhere, right? You're just trying to get cheap books. And they did it, and we ignored it. And Jack and all those booksellers who built it are heroic, and they built something that none of us could ever conceive of if it didn't exist. And I say they built it, it's really the community too, and folks like, people who work in publishing and people who helped make those stores so special. And the idea of trying to go into that space and someone who's an enthusiast who didn't build it, I had nothing to do with it other than being an enthusiast. And so I can bring my ego to it and say, this is the best bookstore in the world. And we are all it's going to be a loss for all of us if it goes out of business. Let's figure out a different model. We know the argument itself already exists, right? Really briefly, prior to moving to Chicago, I was in the Bay Area, and I worked a lot in Silicon Valley, and I was at Stanford, and before that Berkeley, and there were students who are 23 years old, and they're going to make their first million by the time they hit 25, and they're going to do that with a deck. They're going to give you 20 pages. They're going to go to Sand Hill Road, and they're going to go to a venture capitalist, and they're going to put that deck in front of them and say, give me millions, and they'll get it with a deck. We have a 10,000 square foot argument on behalf of this incredible concept that doesn't exist anywhere else. And all I'm trying to do is take that and say, well, let's figure out how to not only support this store, but build stores like it in other communities who want them.
So is that the model to help other stores be created?
It's the third part of it. The first part is just keep these stores going. I'm really selfish. I want to be browsing in like 30 years. I want to browse at the Seminary Co-op. And so like there's a selfishness to it.
So self-preservation first. And then
self-preservation first. And then second is having a professional track for booksellers. Booksellers, and I'll say this, and we're both in positions where we're the ones deciding what money goes into it. But booksellers make retail wages, and it is pitiful. It's incredibly it's an impossible business. And so one of the ways in which things work in a profitable bookstore is you're ensuring that you're paying minimum wage and as few benefits as possible. And even so for stores that do offer those things, then you're paying, I started when we were paying $8.25 an hour in 2014. And I felt like a hero when I raised that wage to $10 an hour. Minimum wage in Chicago is now $15 an hour. And we're sitting here trying to compete basically with minimum wage for work that is of like the highest quality, the highest caliber in the industry. And we just want to be poorly paid like a librarian or like a publisher. Like, can we be poorly paid? Like, everyone makes too little. But that argument, so that's the second thing. And then the third thing would be to get other stores who are interested in it involved, or other communities, not stores, other communities. So, you're keeping this legacy going, which is incredible. And there aren't a lot of cities even that have a store like this. I mean, it's remarkable. And to think about what it would take for that community to recognize that it's incumbent upon them, not upon you, to figure out a model that we should all get together and build these spaces. That actually is a huge part of the argument, not where the money comes from.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of you have to figure out a way to turn off the economic part of your brain when you're shopping in a bookstore, because as soon as you start thinking about dollars and cents, you're going to use the money in a different way.
Yeah, certainly if it's retail.
Yeah.
I mean, think about a cable company, right? And how much your cable bills are, or your internet bills are, or all of these other things that you think nothing about spending the money. And the fact is, you're not actually being as rational as we like to think we are when we're making economic decisions. We're not really comparing, commodities or experiences or things that are beyond measure, the most important things in the world. Those are the things that actually we should be quantifying or qualifying, and we just don't.
In terms of you're going around the country and looking at special stores, I know there's definitely, you are from the Bay Area, and I know there seems to be a special place in your heart for city lights, because they
Absolutely.
get kind of mentioned a lot in the book.
They're amazing. Yeah.
I can think of a few other stores. You did actually mention the old Stanford bookstore, which was where the buyer had a goal of buying. Now, you said every book published. What did you mean by that?
This is what they said. Elton Speed, who was the director there for, I guess he left in the 90s. wanted to buy a copy of every book. Now, the point of like, what does every book mean? Is it self-published books? Is it every romance novel? Right. That's a great question. You can read his book. He wrote a book called The Principles of College Bookstore Management. I have a copy. And you can try and understand what he was trying to do. But the legend had it, and I was in that space, and a lot of people remembered him and knew his work. But that was the goal. And when I was there, I left in 2014. It was written into the contract that the store had to carry a minimum of 72,000 books separate from the course books.
And that Follett was already running it, but they still had to do that. Wow.
And the idea that you're writing into the contract 72,000 books, every university should do this.
Well, this is one of the things I was asking you about before, is that not only is not every bookstore doing it, most universities have no interest in bookstores. They have decided that bookstores are not part of the academic tradition, like that has nothing, there's nothing that a bookstore has to do with academia.
Right. Well, that's also on some level true with the university presses. But
it is absolutely true on the university presses.
What it is they're seeing, and this is an argument about retail, and it's an argument about, if you want to be a great university press, you know what you should do? Publish Deborah Birx's book. Because those are the books that sell a lot and sell quickly. But no university press would ever publish that book because it's not a rigorous book. It's not a serious book. And the fact that we are looking to the university presses and to their college bookstores as income, I say we, universities, administration, as income.
They want to monetize both of them. Yeah.
Monetize both of them, and not a way to burnish the reputation of the university. And there have been some really interesting conversations about this, but again, back to the sidelines question. So university bookstores have become campus stores. They drop the book and they sell t-shirts and sweatshirts and convenience stores and school supplies, all of which are super important. There could be a separate department store. And then there can be a bookstore that's just books and the experience of being around books. And that's the thing that's subsidized. And by subsidized, I don't mean it's like a charity. I mean, it's a tremendous value that is worth investing in. And the community can and should invest in it.
What's always so confounding to me is that the university can say, well, university presses and bookstores have to pay for themselves because they're not really part of the academic tradition. But dining halls and gyms,
Right.
now that's
Right.
academia.
Exactly. Well, there's an interest. You mentioned that we have two stores, and we do, and they're very different stores. They're 1,000 yards away from each other. So it really is like an East Wing and a West Wing. And the store 57th Street Books, which is a wonderful, wonderful store. The heart of it is a children's section. And then it has mysteries and cookbooks and romances. And there's a great community there. And the university, on some level, almost sees that store as the more important store for its community because there aren't a lot of community resources. And so a place for people to bring their kids is really important. A third place to hang out is really important to the university. And to their credit, they have been supportive, both stores. But it's interesting that the services are on some level seen as valuable in a way that the bookstore is not.
The fact that University of Chicago is even thinking about that, though,
is miraculous.
It is amazing.
We don't exist without the University of Chicago. It's amazing. And when we think about like other bookstores that have this or have anything like this, and including Stanford, I'd include Harvard, Princeton, and then there are very few after that.
There are very few. I mean, because when we're talking about Harvard, we're not talking about the Coop anymore,
right? Because
that's a Barnes and Noble. We're talking about Harvard Bookstore, which also it is not part of Harvard, but it does get support for it.
Right.
It is basically the landlord. Harvard is the landlord for them. So.
Well, and I will say I'm talking about both actually. For the Harvard Coop, so I was there 2 weeks ago, and I've been there many times. And this is not going to make me any friends in the independent bookselling world, but the Harvard Coop is an incredible store with a selection they have so much more inventory than a Harvard bookstore, including from university presses. The philosophy section is 3 bookcases at Harvard Coop, and it is 3 times as large. And Harvard bookstore.
We just read the article in the Times that said Barnes and Noble is our new best friend. So why would we be upset by this? But does Barnes and Noble duplicate that at the other? They run a lot of university press stores.
No,
like even at Yale.
No, the Yale, there is nothing to speak of at Yale. I mean, it's horrible, right? There's nothing to speak of at Yale. And this is the argument some people have said on this tour, like, well, obviously you're at the University of Chicago. Of course you can do that there, but Harvard can't do it. So even the Coop, I'm saying it's like a better selection in some way,
right,
because they can afford to spend all of their money on University Press books. Like they've got that model that's different. It's the same reason that Stanford does it too.
Right.
Is they're
But it sounds like it's written in, it must be written.
it's written in the contract, and it's
Yeah.
something that this is the point, though, is that we have to argue for it even there. Princeton has an amazing model. It's an independent bookstore called Labyrinth. They're brilliant, brilliant booksellers, and they are constant. They're also really good at advocating on behalf of what they do. These are rhetorical questions, and I think that I'm hopeful that we can stop apologizing for the whys and efficiencies that make us great, and that we can then think about these strengths, articulate them, and find ways, the way that these students, going to Sand Hill Road are making the case to what they believe in. Like you all know what these stores can do. You all know what it feels like to walk into these spaces, and why you're here, tonight. I mean, why you're going to wander these shelves. Like there is tremendous value, and it's clear. And why don't we celebrate it and find a model to support it?
Do you, in terms of, gosh, we're like ready for questions. Okay, I just have to ask. I have like 6 hours worth of questions, so that's called over preparation. I wanted to ask you. One thing I wanted to ask you is, you definitely, from the book, you definitely enjoy creative characterization. You mentioned the city lights, sections like stolen continent and muckraking. You mentioned creating a comparative religion section out of history. Are there any other subsections that you are particularly proud of that you feel are relatively unique to your store?
I will begin by saying that the staff recommendation section, which you mentioned earlier, is always my favorite section to go to. And that is one of the best arguments on behalf of idiosyncratic sections, because what you can find there, you never know how they're not connected by anything other than who happens to be working there at the moment. Are there special sections? We love series, especially series that are put out by university presses. So the Clay Sanskrit Library, which NYU puts out, or the Murty Classical Library of India, which Harvard puts out, our very famous Loeb Library section. We love that. And whenever there's enough critical mass of a new series to put them together, it's wonderful. There's a library of Arabic literature that NYU puts out that's great, and they look beautiful on a shelf. We just started, it's really hard to mess with the legacy of Seminary Co-op. I mean, this is the reputation.
You touch something and
You gotta be
somebody probably yells at you.
Oh, yeah, you touch anything. Yeah. And one of the things that we have a beautiful, expansive literary criticism section, but it's not literary criticism. It's primary literature by novelists or poets. It's secondary literature about them. It's biographies, and then it also has creative nonfiction. And I love that section, and I hate browsing it because it's just everything. And I don't do literary theory. I'm not smart enough to follow what half that stuff is. So I don't read any of that. It's all in language I just don't speak yet. Maybe I'll learn it one day. But I love nothing more than a collection of essays by a novelist. Like one of my favorite things to read. I love letters. I love even biographies. And so we just broke out a literary nonfiction section separate from criticism, which I'm hopeful to break out into an essays and letters and biographies. It's 3 separate sections. You mentioned the memo and summary that Mary Capello writes about in her amazing book lecture. By the way, if anyone needs book recommendations, you've got pros up here. So when you think about your questions, you might want to ask for book recommendations. But lecture by Mary Capello talks about memo and summary. And I happen to love concision, especially in writing. So I love poetry, but I also love aphorisms and maxims and proverbs, which they're all different. And we would have different sections for all 3 of those in my ideal bookstore that only I and maybe a couple of people in the
An
audience
aphorism subsection.
aphorism would be one of many. There'd be aphorisms and apothegms, which are different, of course, from maxims. And you got to get them just right because it creates a different.
Oh, okay. I gotta throw questions out to the audience.
Epitaphs.
Did you so this was just a compliment, and thank you for having a Taoism section.
We love the Taoism section.
We have a question from one of our listeners at home. Should we repeat that then? So can you talk about how browsing by algorithm, how it is affecting book selling and retail in general? And
definition of browsing by algorithm? That's a good question.
Can you ask Dave what the question is?
Yeah,
Particularly Amazon, the suggestion.
Oh, AI, yeah.
yeah, it depends on what you're looking for in a recommendation. And so for those who want an echo chamber and want to be told, based on everything you've ever done with this company, here's what you're going to want to do and predict it in that way. Great. And you probably don't really need the experience of the browse per se. We did a panel, the first day of the tour was in Detroit, and it was wonderful. It's a great bookstore town. There was a panel of booksellers, and a woman who runs John King, which is one of our great bookstores, said, browsers go into bookstores in search of themselves. And the notion and that struck me as, yeah, it might be a little bit flowery to say it that way, but how many of us have some of our best, I don't even say memories, but like most meaningful experiences that started with a seed in wandering a store and finding something they didn't know they wanted. And the difference between that discovery of the thing you didn't know you wanted or needed versus the thing that, based on what other people are buying, you know should want. I mean, those are like very different things. And what happens when your eyes are just wandering and you recognize, oh yeah, Joan Didion's sitting over there. I forgot about Joan Didion. Like, right, I should read the old essays. And
can I confess to the retail model I used when I opened the store in terms of discovery? I read a book about Trader Joe's, and it was such an interesting book because Trader Joe's is very different from other food markets because they don't really take co-op. And if you know anything about the grocery store business, it is the margins are so bad in the center of the store that all the money comes from paid placement. And that's why just about every grocery store looks alike. But Trader Joe's doesn't take the money because almost everything is private label or from really small vendors that can't pay the money. And so they're able to do things that a grocery store can't afford to do, like break up an aisle, put in a weird display, cross-shelve things. And what I was fascinated by was this sense of discovery you get there. And that's what one of the things that we did when we opened the store is we I think doubled the amount of table displays that we had, because it was important for me to display books. Not necessarily, I don't cross shelve, cross section things, because then we can't find anything, but we do have, and 13 years later, I'm a little exhausted by all the making the displays, but it was just really important for me to be able to have somebody experience finding something that they, if they weren't looking in the case, they'd be looking somewhere else.
Yeah, well, and the notion again that we know what we want when we walk into a store, like as booksellers, you said you can't find books if you cross the list them. Like, we want to be able to find the book for the person who's just in and out, for sure. We want to be efficient in that way. But so many of us just while away an afternoon and want to hang out and see what's coming out and just have some sort of conversation with the stacks. And that is really the thing that I care about as a bookseller and as a browser, and I'm hoping to create for others in terms of.
There's a percent. I mean, I haven't read it lately, but I read a lot remember there were going to be no more physical books in 2014, and one of the rules that they said was the more somebody knows what they want, the more likely they're going to buy it online from Amazon. And so the perception was that you have to cater to people who don't know what they want.
Right. Well,
and that's about all. There's a lot about browsing in here, by the way.
There is.
Browsing is very important.
Well, and I will say one thing to speak to that, and this will also not make me popular with independent booksellers, which is if people want to get books cheaper on Amazon, like that, I understand that. I have no problem with that idea. What I do have a problem with is the fact that the largest seller of books in the world and in the country is not a bookseller. They are not thinking about the full ecosystem of what it takes to run these businesses and to get books into print and to get books distributed and to have bookstores and other models of selling books and to think about the authors and all of the work that goes into it. It's a profession that is incredibly complex and incredibly nuanced. And Amazon has been historically and continues to use it as a loss leader, as a way to bring people in the door to get something cheaply that really is of tremendous value so that they can make more money on higher margin items. And it is obscene. And if Amazon just simply said, we're going to take 1/10 of 1% of our profits and give them to publishers and booksellers the way that some authors like James Patterson have done, which is not a model any of us want as the charity, but that would be the first step toward making things right and acknowledging that they are messing with something that is so delicate and so valuable. And so Amazon is doing the wrong thing there, but the consumers anyone who buys books from Amazon, they're doing it for 10,000 reasons. So I don't wrinkle my nose, but I do hope Amazon figures it out. Yeah.
I'm all wrinkles.
No, it's Nirvana. Yeah. No, it's like one of my favorite stores in the world. I went there for the first time 4 years after I went to the seminary co-op. I had a different experience from you about the Taoism section, which is that they had a Vedanta section there. In Hinduism, it's a section that all I cared about, all I understood, and it was like half a shelf. And I was thrilled that this half a shelf, they pulled it out, so I didn't have to browse, all 3 bookcases, all 4 bookcases. I could spend a week there and not feel like I've even scratched the surface. It's a great store. I feel the same way about the Strand in New York, which, it's a store I went to growing up. And anyone in the book selling world will say, it's not what it once was. It used to be great. Now it's all a bunch of sidelines. Sure. And then you go into the basement and you get lost in that literary, they have criticism and essays and broken out. And it's incredible. Yeah, those stores are great. As is a store like Source Booksellers in Detroit, which is teeny tiny. You could take it all in one gulp. But the idiosyncratic approach that those buyers have is a delight. I love them all. Big, medium, small. John? Mm-hmm. Can we concisely, just for the audience who's watching, I can try.
Over it again. No, I think basically the question was, with the finite resources you have, how do you serve the multiple communities that are in your area that have sometimes diverse needs and may not always want the books that you are providing?
Yeah. So there is a line in the book that says a good bookstore reflects its community. A great bookstore both reflects and creates its community. And one of the things that I revere about my predecessors, and Jack is the name that people know, but all of the booksellers who came before who really built that space, and the community members who built that space, is that they didn't only reflect the community. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to see we don't have a Vedanta section in our store. It's not about my taste and what I like to read. If it was, the front table would be all old books because I read very few new books. If I didn't write this, I would get to it maybe in 5 or 10 years. I got a waiting list, and I think that the notion though of seeing a community expansively and not just taking what is given is critically important. I'm not going to get into the details of geography. I appreciate that your knowledge of our community, but we are a South Side of Chicago bookstore and always have been. It has always been. The university is a critical partner, but we are. It's basically like downtown Chicago for the South Side is where we are, and the idea that we can only sell books to academics, only sell academic books to academics, or serious books, I should say, and that there isn't a serious general reader that might live in a university neighborhood, and they might live in South Shore or Bronzeville, which are 2 of the most vibrant literary and artistic communities in the country, that we don't have people wandering in from there looking for books that help them understand the world. That is a critical part of what we do, and we don't want to simply reflect what's happening across the street. We're excited by people who are shifting the conversation. We're excited by anything that troubles easy consensus. And that notion to us is like why it matters. So we don't want people to only feel comfortable, to only feel like they're getting exactly what they hoped for. We want them to expand and think about who belongs in these spaces. And our answer is anyone who wants to, read serious books. And yeah.
But before we do Daniel, I think the other John, did you have a question? I shouldn't call you other John. You're also John.
My question is kind of based on a premise that comes with the
So why were the superstores so successful if they were anonymous and not about the local shop? Well, as someone who grew up in Barnes and Noble, got my start there, I will question the premise in one specific way, two specific ways. One is that some of the best booksellers I know and are still in it in the independent world, it happens to be, were from chain bookstores, but they were local. We lived in the community. We knew people. It wasn't anonymous. And when like Michael Chabon used to shop at our store in the Bay Area, like not only did everyone know him, but they knew him as a human, not just as an author. But the second thing is, I don't think, and I write about this a little bit in the book, people don't come into the store to see me, or I mean, probably to see you. They don't come in to see me. Like they're not there for the bookseller. They're there for the space. Ultimately, I think. And if you create a great space that is, as a good browse, it's the presence of books that matters. And going into a store, I worked at a store in Seattle, Barnes and Noble in Seattle, that had a full Loeb library, and half the staff were PhDs, and it was right by the University of Washington, and it was a huge store. It did 6 times the amount of sales and 6 times the amount, more than inventory than we have at the co-op. And I was just like, this is a great bookstore. And then I go into an independent store that was kind of like ho-hum and think, well, and I advocated for this. Is going to get boring, but really quickly. I used to advocate for this with the American Booksellers Association to drop independent from independent bookseller. Why don't we just call ourselves booksellers? Because that's what we are. Why do we have to define ourselves by what is different from the chain? Barnes and Noble booksellers, that's their title, and then we're the independent booksellers. Independent of what? We're booksellers. And so all of which is to say, I just want good bookstores. I don't care if it's run by Barnes and Noble or Follett at Harvard, or if it's independent, or if it's small, medium or large. It's just like, are the spaces creating interesting browsage? Are the booksellers like nice people? Like I don't like the gruff. I should say, I like the gruff smoker. And I like books selling in the 80s. I mean, when I started, going to bookstores where you're smoking cigarettes and you're growling at the customer, that actually is where I'm most comfortable. And I don't want anyone talking to me when I'm browsing. Actually, I often will have headphones in, but I don't run stores like that.
You're just a delightful customer.
I'm really delightful customer.
I would just like to say, in terms of the growth of the Barnes and Noble superstores, is a part of the issue was taking, a lot of people feel like the growth of the Barnes and Noble model grew out of the New Yorker article about Tattered Cover, where it said that Tattered Cover was the best bookstore in the country, and most people had never been there. And the idea was that you could maximize the bookstore experience and reap the benefits by maximizing selection. And really, the reason it was successful is because that was the case, and Amazon killed it because you couldn't duplicate the perceived selection of everything, even though it wasn't there.
That's right. That's right.
And so Tom?
You are really describing that life is not funding for it.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. So just briefly summarizing, the question is, how do you build demand? We have enough supply and maybe not enough demand and readership, right? We've been joking about the wrinkling of the nose, but one of the things I'll say really seriously is that part of why I don't wrinkle my nose at anyone in the industry, and why even with, like, say, Amazon could be heroes if they helped reconstitute the industry, is that we're not fighting each other. We should not be fighting each other in the book industry or in academia or the humanities, or like the art. if there is an enemy, and that's a question, there might not be an enemy, but if there is one, it's definitely outside of the industry, and it's definitely, we're fighting on behalf of attention and on behalf of the, again, rhetorical, like winning this rhetorical battle so that there is readership. That is a really important part of community work that is maybe it's something we could be doing, but my hope is that we can just sell books and have other people do that. But that is the point. How do we help build that? So I think it's a great question. I think above all, I write about 4 qualities that a bookseller brings really quickly. It's filtration, selection, assemblage, and enthusiasm. The enthusiasm piece is the one that I'm like most, like is closest to me right now. And I feel like even like being on this tour and talking about the book and the writing itself, you'll see it's like all celebration. There's no lamentation, because I just want to share my enthusiasm, which I used to share on behalf of single books that I love, to share that on behalf of bookstores themselves. And then obviously reading. This book is probably as much about reading, if not more, than it is about bookstores. And it's as much about the presence of books anywhere, personal libraries, bookstores, wherever, than it is about any single bookstore.
I think we have time for one more question. I think it's going to be Daniel because I cut him off before.
Yeah, so the question about international models for bookselling, no, we're facing different problems for sure. There are a lot of similarities in some of the problems, but like in Delhi, there's a huge intellectual property issue, and the ability to publish and maintain intellectual property rights is actually like one of the biggest challenges there. Pirated books are everywhere. But in France, for instance, there's a really interesting model where it is against the law to discount books beyond 5% of the list price, because it is considered a great cultural good and it's not to be discounted. And Amazon is in France, and that model, and it might be a good model or not, I'm not advocating for it, but it's an interesting model. And in addition, in France, there is a professional bookseller track. And in order to become a bookseller, we need to be certified. Which is not the case here. And what does that then do for the profession to create a professional track? And think about like libraries, right? So that you need, a degree in information science or library science, depending on what it's called, where you go. For bookselling, you don't, and you're probably doing more like work directly with the books and the readers as a bookseller than you are as a librarian. And so why don't we need that? So yeah, we are interested in. The guild mentality is not, but the idea that a profession becomes a profession by dint of a few letters after your name is, and why don't we see it as the keeper of these spaces?
I just wanted to comment that I've been thinking about every time you see a book that's interesting, I'll get to it in 5 years. I'm thinking of my accounting class, college. You are a FIFO reader. I am a LIFO reader.
First in, first out versus last in, first out. Okay, I like that. But I make room for serendipity. I mean, there are books that just show up. I'm like, I have to stop everything and read it.
So you can't cut the key.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
All the time.
It's good to know.
Absolutely.
I wanted to let everybody know that you will be signing books at the front desk. We are recording this event and we will be sending it out to both the people online, and if you registered here, we'll be sending it to you as well, so you can share it with other people. There's probably a number of better interviewers who are online. You could watch those too. And thank you very much for everything that you're doing, Jeff. And thanks everybody for coming, because we wouldn't have a bookstore without you.
Thank you.